The mother gave birth to 5 children, but they were all deaf-mute. 25 years later. Silver Creek Town, nestled among the arid hills, had never been a place for those who were different. The people here held firm beliefs in omens, fate, and mysterious curses passed down through generations. When someone deviated from the norm, they became the target of suspicion and alienation. Elizabeth Miller understood that better than anyone. The first time she realized her family was not welcome was when her eldest son, Luke, turned 3 and had yet to utter a single word. At first, people assumed he was simply a late talker. But when Elizabeth took him to a doctor in the city, the diagnosis left her stunned. Luke was born deaf. When her second child, Matthew, was born with the same condition, whispers began to spread throughout the town. There's definitely something wrong with that family. God has punished them. But Elizabeth paid no heed. She tried to live a normal life with her husband, Thomas, and their 2 sons. She believed that as long as she loved and cared for them, everything would be fine. However, when 3 more of her children, Sophia, Andrew, and Helen, were also born into eternal silence, the townspeople's patience wore thin. They are cursed. These words were no longer just rumors, they became the truth in the eyes of many. The villagers began to avoid Elizabeth and her family. The neighborhood children stopped playing with Luke and Matthew, even when the boys tried to engage them through drawings or hand gestures. Shopkeepers eyed her warily whenever she stepped into the market. Some even hastily made the sign of the cross as she passed by. Gradually, the whispers turned into tangible actions. "She'll bring bad luck to our home," a middle-aged woman murmured to the bakery owner, refusing to sell bread to Elizabeth. Landlords began to reject her family as well. "I'm sorry, but I can't continue renting to you. Someone else is offering a higher price." That was the excuse they gave, but Elizabeth knew the real reason. One day, she took Sophia to a fabric store to buy some cheap cloth for sewing clothes, but the shop owner, Mrs. Rosa, quickly pulled the curtains down, signaling that the store was closed. Yet, the moment Elizabeth turned away, Mrs. Rosa reopened the door for another customer. Elizabeth's heart clenched. But the worst was yet to come. One morning, when she brought Luke and Matthew to the town square to play with other children, she noticed a group of parents whispering among themselves. Then, a tall, gaunt woman, Mrs. Margaret, stepped forward. "Elizabeth, I think it would be best if your children didn't play here." Elizabeth frowned. "Why not? They are just kids, like any other." Mrs. Margaret gave a cold smile. "But they're not like the other children, are they? They can't speak, they can't hear. If something happens to them, who will be responsible? We don't want our children to be affected." Anger boiled inside Elizabeth. "Do you think my children could harm anyone? They are completely harmless. Harmless or not, they don't belong here." Mrs. Margaret's voice carried an air of authority. Luke and Matthew looked up at their mother, their innocent eyes filled with confusion. They didn't understand the woman's words, but they could feel the hostility in the stares and gestures around them. Elizabeth wanted to fight back. She wanted to scream at them, to tell them that her children deserved a normal life. But as she looked into the cold, judgmental faces before her, she realized that no matter what she said, they would not change their minds. She gripped her son's hands tightly and turned away. When they got home, Elizabeth cried. But she didn't cry because she was shunned. She cried because her children couldn't cry out loud to express their pain. In the months that followed, the discrimination only worsened. Some mothers in town began warning their children to stay away from Elizabeth's home. She overheard whispers as she walked past the market. "There's a reason they were born that way. Maybe it's karma." That last sentence sent a chill down Elizabeth's spine. What had she done to deserve such a punishment? One day, she was denied a job as a laundress at the only inn in town. The innkeeper, Mr. Stephen, whom she had worked for over 3 years, suddenly told her that the inn no longer needed extra hands. But the very next day, Elizabeth saw another woman doing the same job. "I think he prefers normal people," a woman whispered to her when she saw Elizabeth standing outside the inn, gazing bitterly at the scene. Elizabeth began to feel that this town was turning into a cage, trapping her and her children. Every door was closing in her face, and every opportunity to make a living was slipping away. Yet, despite being shunned by society, Elizabeth refused to collapse. One afternoon, as the sun slowly dipped behind the old rooftops, Elizabeth held her 5 children's hands and stood on the empty road, looking toward the distant hills. She knew this was only the beginning of injustice. She knew darker days still lay ahead. But she could not give up. Because if she fell, who would protect these children? A cold wind swept through the narrow alleys of Silver Creek, carrying with it the musty scent of old stone walls. That night, Elizabeth Miller could not sleep. She watched her 5 children huddled together on the worn wooden bed, their innocent faces blissfully unaware that tomorrow would be even harder than today. She sat in silence by the window, her eyes blankly staring into the darkness. Lately, she had felt a strange sense of unease deep in her heart. And then, disaster struck. Her husband, Thomas, was a strong man who worked as a miner in a quarry near town. His job was dangerous, but it was the family's main source of income. Every morning, he kissed his wife and children on the forehead before leaving, promising to return safely. But that morning, as Elizabeth was preparing breakfast for the children, she heard a commotion outside. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, speaking in anxious tones. Then, a woman came running, breathless. "Elizabeth, the quarry, there's been an accident." Elizabeth's heart plummeted into an abyss. She bolted outside, running straight toward the quarry, not caring that she was barefoot on the rough, uneven ground. Her breath was ragged, her ears ringing from the shouts and cries echoing through the air. When she arrived, the sight before her plunged her into a nightmare. A section of the quarry had collapsed. Workers scrambled back and forth, desperately digging through the rubble. Elizabeth scanned the crowd, searching for Thomas, but he was nowhere in sight. Then she saw Mr. Phillip, the quarry manager, standing among a group of men, his face grim. Elizabeth rushed to him, grabbing his arm. "Where is Thomas? Where is my husband?" Mr. Phillip looked at her, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Elizabeth." Elizabeth shook her head. "No, no, this can't be. He's trapped inside." She heard nothing after that. Her mind went blank. Her legs buckled beneath her, collapsing onto the cold, hard ground. The wailing of women around her filled the air, but she could not cry. Thomas never came home again. The funeral took place 3 days later. But unlike other funerals in town, only a handful of people attended. Some avoided her, as if her grief itself was a bad omen that could spread. A few women whispered behind her back. "She lost her husband. Now she'll suffer even more. Perhaps this is punishment for that family." Elizabeth heard every word. But she no longer had the strength to react. After everyone had left, only she and her 5 children remained standing before Thomas's grave. Luke touched her face, signing a question. "Where's Dad?" Elizabeth looked at her son, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She could not answer. She had no husband to help her anymore. No savings to fall back on. And most of all, no one to share her grief. But Elizabeth could not give up. She began taking on any work she could find to feed her children. She washed clothes for wealthy families. She went to Mrs. Louise's house every morning to cook. She cleaned at Mr. Stevens' inn. She did everything, from dawn until late at night. But no matter how much she worked, it was never enough to feed 5 children. Some nights, she went without food so her children could eat. Some days, she had to borrow a bit of flour from neighbors just to make breakfast for them. But the worst part was that the discrimination never faded. The townspeople only became more convinced that her family was cursed. That's why her husband died. That family only brings bad luck. Elizabeth heard it all. But she didn't care. The only thing that mattered was her 5 children. And yet, even her work did not last. One day, when Elizabeth arrived at the inn as usual, Mr. Stephen looked at her with a regretful expression. "Elizabeth, I'm sorry, but starting today, you don't need to come anymore." She froze. "Why?" Mr. Stephen hesitated. "It's just, someone else needs the job more." But Elizabeth knew that wasn't the truth. The next day, as she passed by the inn, she saw another woman cleaning inside. It wasn't a stranger, it was Mrs. Margaret's maid. Elizabeth clenched her fists. That woman had interfered in her life once again. But she had no time for resentment. She had children to care for. She turned to look for work elsewhere. But every door was closed to her. No one dared to hire her. No one wanted to be associated with a cursed family. That night, Elizabeth sat at the empty dinner table, watching her 5 children dozing off in hunger. She gripped her hands tightly, trying to hold back the tears. She had lost her husband. And now, she might lose everything. But Elizabeth would not allow that to happen. Even if the entire town abandoned her, she had to keep going. Because she would not let her children starve. The sun rose high, shining down on the red rooftops of Silver Creek. But for Elizabeth Miller, every day was just another battle without end. Since losing her husband, she had lost the only protection she had. And since Mrs. Margaret's interference, she had lost her chance to survive. Margaret was not an ordinary woman. She was the owner of vast farmlands surrounding the town, possessed a chain of stores, an inn, and even had connections with the town's priest. To many, Margaret was the most powerful woman in Silver Creek. But to Elizabeth, she was the embodiment of injustice. Elizabeth stood before the grandest house in town, the estate of Margaret. For 3 days, she had searched everywhere for work, but no one would hire her. She knew the reason. And now, she wanted Margaret to say it to her face. The door opened. A young maid, Rose, saw Elizabeth and gasped. "Elizabeth? What are you doing here?" "I want to see Margaret." Elizabeth's voice was cold. Rose hesitated. "She doesn't like unexpected visitors." "Then tell her I won't leave until I see her." Rose swallowed hard, then quickly hurried inside. Moments later, a sharp voice rang out from within the house. "Let her in." Elizabeth stepped inside, taking in the extravagance of the estate walls adorned with expensive embroidered tapestries, glittering chandeliers, polished marble floors. In the center of the grand room, Margaret sat in a luxurious armchair, a cup of mint tea in her hand. She took a slow sip, not bothering to look at Elizabeth. "I assume you're here to complain about losing your job." Elizabeth clenched her fists, her voice low. "You were behind this, weren't you?" Margaret shrugged. "Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. But whether I was or not, who do you think would believe you?" Elizabeth took a step forward. "Why are you doing this? What have I ever done to you?" This time, Margaret looked directly at her. Her eyes glowed with disdain. "You are a bad omen. You and your mute children are a disgrace to this town." Each word stabbed into Elizabeth like a knife. Margaret set her teacup down and crossed her arms. "We are a traditional town. We believe in good things, not in cursed families like yours." Elizabeth gritted her teeth. "The children have done nothing wrong." Margaret let out a cold chuckle. "Whether they have or not doesn't matter. What matters is that no one wants to see you here anymore. Do you understand, Elizabeth? No one wants to hire you. No one wants to be near your family." Elizabeth's fists tightened, her nails digging into her skin. "You can't stop me from working. I just want to make a living for my children." Margaret tilted her head. True. But if you insist on staying, you have only two choices. She paused for a moment, then spoke with chilling finality. 1. You leave town. 2. You and your children starve to death. Elizabeth shuddered. Margaret waved a hand dismissively. Now, get out of my house. I won't waste any more time on you. Elizabeth stood still for a moment, then turned and walked out of the estate. She couldn't believe how cruel people could be. She continued searching for work, knocking on every door. But no one dared to hire her. A kind woman named Clara, who owned a small diner in town, secretly pulled her aside. I truly want to help you, but if I hire you, I'll lose all my customers. She could ruin my business. Elizabeth nodded, her heart sinking. Margaret had truly won. That night, Elizabeth sat in her rundown house, watching her 5 children fall asleep in hunger. Luke woke up first, looking at his mother with worried eyes. He signed with his hands. Are you okay? Elizabeth gave him a faint smile, but it was forced. I'm fine, sweetheart. She stroked Luke's hair, but inside, she was breaking. What would happen tomorrow? She had no job, no money, and now, no way out. The next morning, shocking news spread through town. Elizabeth's landlord had decided not to renew her lease. She has no money, how could she possibly pay? And even if she could, who wants a cursed family staying here any longer? That afternoon, Elizabeth received an official notice. She had 3 days to leave the house. 3 days. Where could she go? She looked around the small house where she had raised her children for so many years. It was not wealthy, not spacious, but at least, it was the only home they had. And now, they were about to lose everything. Elizabeth clenched her fists, tears spilling down her cheeks. Why was fate so cruel? Rain began to fall as Elizabeth packed up the few belongings they had. The wind howled through the cracks in the door, like a mournful wail in the winter night. Ice-cold droplets seeped through the leaky roof, but she had no mind to care anymore. For the past 3 days, she had desperately sought help. She had knocked on every door, visited every shop, reached out to every old acquaintance, but all she received in return were cold refusals. We can't help you, Elizabeth. You know, if we help you, Margaret will make things difficult for us. Elizabeth swallowed her tears, nodded in gratitude, and walked away. She understood. They were only trying to protect themselves. But understanding didn't make it hurt any less. On the final day, Elizabeth stood before her house one last time. It was an old, crumbling structure, with peeling plaster walls and a roof that was rotting away. But it was the only place she had. Luke grabbed her hand, his large, round eyes filled with worry. Mom, where are we going? Elizabeth bit her lip. She had no answer. She only knew that they could not stay here. They stepped out onto the streets, beneath the pounding rain. No one came to help. No one opened their doors. The children shivered in their thin clothing. Elizabeth pulled the tattered shawl tighter around them, but nothing could shield them from the biting cold. They wandered through the empty streets. Rain mixed with tears. They had nowhere to go. Elizabeth turned to the church. She banged on the door, knocking so hard that her hands turned red. After a moment, the door creaked open. Father Anthony appeared, a candle in his hand. Elizabeth? His voice carried hesitation. What are you doing here? Elizabeth clenched her hands. Please, Father, let us stay for the night. Father Anthony remained silent. He looked past Elizabeth, at the children trembling, their small faces streaked with rain. For a brief moment, his heart wavered. But then, he sighed and shook his head. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, but the church cannot shelter those who carry a curse. Elizabeth froze. She could not believe what she had just heard. What did you say? Father Anthony avoided her gaze. We must protect the congregation. If they do not want you here, I cannot go against them. But we have nowhere else to go. Elizabeth choked out. The priest sighed again, then slowly closed the door. God will light your path. Clack. The church door slammed shut in front of Elizabeth. She stood still, her hand pressed against the cold wood. Inside, the candlelight flickered warmly. Outside, she and her children were abandoned in the freezing rain. They kept walking. The wind howled, cutting into their numb skin. Sophia whimpered, but no one could hear her. Matthew gripped his little sister's hand, his eyes red with unshed tears. Elizabeth bit her lip until it bled. They needed shelter. They could not wander any longer. And then, she thought of one last place. Elizabeth walked toward the towering gates of Margaret's estate. Hatred filled her heart, but at this moment, she had no other choice. She took a deep breath, then knocked firmly on the door. The door creaked open, and Rose, the maid, gasped when she saw Elizabeth standing there, drenched and shivering. Why you, what are you doing here? Elizabeth tightened her fists. I want to see her. Rose hesitated but then turned and hurried inside. A moment later, Margaret stepped out, arms crossed, looking down at Elizabeth as if she were a beggar. I thought you had already left town. Elizabeth lifted her head, her voice hoarse. You've won. I have nothing left. But please, let me and my children stay for the night. Just one night. Margaret let out a laugh, cold as the winter wind. Stay the night? In my house? She shook her head. Who do you think you are, Elizabeth? Elizabeth gritted her teeth. They are children. You may hate me, but what have they done wrong? Margaret frowned slightly, then slowly pulled a small pouch of coins from her pocket. She tossed it onto the ground at Elizabeth's feet. If you leave town tonight, this money is yours. Elizabeth stared at the pouch. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get her children far away. But then, she looked at her 5 children. She could not teach them to bow before injustice. She lifted her head and met Margaret's gaze. No. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? Elizabeth nodded. Absolutely. Margaret smirked. Then let me help you. She waved her hand, and immediately, several young men appeared. Elizabeth barely had time to react. A stone flew toward her, striking her shoulder. Then another. And another. Luke threw his arms around his little sister, shielding her. Matthew grabbed his mother's hand, signing frantically, "Run." Elizabeth gritted her teeth, scooped Sophia into her arms, and ran toward the dark alley. Margaret's laughter echoed behind her. Run, Elizabeth. Run until no one remembers you anymore. Elizabeth clutched her children close, hiding in a dark corner of the alley. She looked into their frightened eyes. She wanted to tell them everything would be okay. But she couldn't lie. Tears streamed down her face. She had lost everything. All she and her children had left was darkness. And silence. That night, Elizabeth and her 5 children huddled together in a cold, desolate alley, sheltering from the freezing rain that drenched the town of Silver Creek. Their clothes were soaked, their bodies trembling, but none of them dared to move. Luke wrapped his arms around Sophia, his eyes filled with worry. Matthew gripped his mother's hand tightly, as if afraid that if he let go, they would all be swallowed by the endless night. Elizabeth pulled her tattered shawl around her children, her heart breaking. She had lost everything. She closed her eyes, praying for a miracle. But miracles had never come for her. When the first light of dawn appeared, Elizabeth knew she couldn't let her children endure another night like this. She had to find shelter, even if it was just a small room, a roof to keep out the rain and wind. She took her children's hands and led them toward the church. Even though Father Anthony had turned them away the night before, daylight was different. In front of everyone, he couldn't outright refuse them. When Elizabeth arrived, the church doors were wide open. She saw Father Anthony preparing for the morning service, surrounded by a group of parishioners arranging chairs and candles. She stepped forward, her eyes filled with hope. "Father, please, let my children and me stay." Father Anthony turned, his face briefly flickering with hesitation. He glanced at the people around him, then slowly shook his head. "I already told you, Elizabeth. The church cannot shelter those who carry a curse." Elizabeth clenched her fists. "But this is God's house. God does not abandon his children." Father Anthony sighed, his voice lowering. "God does not abandon anyone. But I must protect my flock. By casting us out?" Elizabeth's voice trembled with anger. A murmur spread through the congregation. "Look at her, she still hasn't left. So stubborn. She doesn't know her place. No one wants to shelter a cursed family." Elizabeth heard every word. She bit her lip until it bled, fighting back tears. She dropped to her knees before Father Anthony. "Please, Father, just one night. I will clean, I will do anything. Just let me and my children stay in a small corner of this church." Father Anthony looked down at the desperate woman before him. For a brief moment, he hesitated. But then, he took a deep breath and turned away. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth. You must leave now." His words sliced through her heart like a knife. She rose to her feet, her eyes empty. Margaret had won. The entire town had abandoned her. She stepped out of the church, too exhausted to beg any longer. But as soon as she descended the steps, she saw Margaret standing there, arms crossed, watching her with a cold smile. "Anyone could have predicted this outcome," she said mockingly. "You resisted for too long, Elizabeth." Elizabeth clenched her jaw but said nothing. Margaret smirked. "If you kneel before me, perhaps I'll reconsider." The crowd fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned to Elizabeth. They were waiting to see what she would do. She felt Helen's tiny hand clutching the hem of her dress. No. She couldn't do it. She had lost everything. But she still had her dignity. Elizabeth lifted her head, her eyes burning with fury. "No." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" Elizabeth met her gaze without wavering. "Absolutely." Margaret chuckled. "Very well. If you won't kneel before me, then kneel before this town." She raised a hand, and immediately, the young men standing nearby understood. A stone flew toward Elizabeth, striking her leg. Another hit her shoulder. Laughter and jeers filled the square. Elizabeth clutched Sophia tightly, pulling her children close as she ran. Margaret stood watching, satisfaction gleaming in her eyes. "Don't ever come back, Elizabeth." Elizabeth and her children ran into a narrow alley. They huddled together, hiding in the darkness. She looked down at Luke, Matthew, Sophia, Andrew, Helen, her precious children. They could not cry. But their eyes said everything. Elizabeth felt her heart shatter. She had lost her home. She had lost her husband. She had lost her faith in humanity. The rain began to fall again. Cold. Dark. No doors opened. No hands reached out. And for the first time in her life, Elizabeth wondered if she should keep fighting at all. The rain continued to pour heavily. Elizabeth held Sophia tightly in her arms, trying to shield her daughter from the freezing droplets seeping through her thin fabric. Luke sat close to his mother, his large eyes gazing up at the pitch-black sky. Matthew, Andrew, and Helen curled up together, shivering from the cold. No one spoke a word. Not because they didn't want to. But because they couldn't. Elizabeth looked up at the empty street. This town, the place she once thought of as home, had become nothing more than a nightmare with no escape. She didn't know how much longer she and her children could endure. The next morning, Elizabeth decided to try one last time. She led her children to the only person she thought might help them. Mrs. Louise. She was one of the wealthiest women in town, but she had once hired Elizabeth to cook for her. Though not particularly kind, at least she had never treated her with the same cruelty as the others. When they reached Mrs. Louise's estate, Elizabeth took a deep breath and knocked on the door. A moment later, the door opened. A young maid peeked out, her eyes widening in surprise. "Elizabeth? You?" "I need to see Mrs. Louise," Elizabeth said quickly. "Please." The maid hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't think. Tell her I only need a place for my children to stay. Just for one night." The girl sighed, then disappeared inside. A moment later, Mrs. Louise stepped out, arms crossed as she looked down at Elizabeth. "You still haven't left town?" Elizabeth swallowed hard. "Please, just a small space in the barn or the storeroom." "My children." Mrs. Louise cut her off. "Do you think I can help you without paying a price? If I take you in, Margaret will punish me." Elizabeth bit her lip. "But they are children, they don't deserve this." Mrs. Louise sighed. "I'm truly sorry." Elizabeth stared at her for a moment, then lowered her head. "I understand. Thank you." She turned away, pulling her children with her. Behind her, the door shut. Once again, she had been abandoned. As night fell, Elizabeth knew she had no other choice. She led her children to the forest just outside the town. There, hidden among the trees, was a small cave that shepherds occasionally used to take shelter from the rain. She hoped no one would find them there. She gathered some damp branches and tried to light a small fire. The weak flames flickered in the darkness, casting a dim glow on her children's pale faces. Luke signed with his hands. "Mom, where will we go tomorrow?" Elizabeth looked at her son, her heart twisting painfully. She didn't know. She truly didn't know. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat there, staring into the endless darkness. She thought of her husband. She thought of the little house they once had. She thought of the days when, despite their poverty, there had still been hope. But now, all she had left was darkness. And silence. The next morning, as Elizabeth was gathering their belongings, she heard footsteps. She held her breath and pulled her children close. A group of men appeared. They were Margaret's guards. One of them stepped forward. "Our mistress has a message for you." Elizabeth stood still, saying nothing. The man smirked. "If you don't leave town today, we will make you regret it." Everything collapsed around her. Elizabeth knew that if she didn't leave, they would follow through with their threat. But where could she go? She clenched her fists, biting her lip until she tasted blood. Luke looked up at her and signed. "Do we have to go?" Elizabeth closed her eyes. A single tear slid down her cheek. She nodded. A few hours later, Elizabeth and her children left Silver Creek. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know what awaited them ahead. They only knew that they could never go back. They had been cast out by the town. Rejected. Thrown into the darkness. The small group left Silver Creek on a bleak morning. No one looked back. No one said goodbye. Not a single person in town showed any sympathy for the lone woman and her 5 deaf children. Elizabeth walked with heavy steps. The cold wind lashed against her skin, making every muscle ache. Her hands gripped her children's tightly, holding them as close as possible, as if afraid that if she loosened her grip, the cruel wind would carry them away. Where were they going? She didn't know. She only knew there was nowhere left to return to. They kept walking, walking, until the sun rose high in the sky. Elizabeth's stomach twisted with hunger. She knew her children felt the same. Last night, they had nothing to eat except for a few dry crumbs she had picked up from the trash behind the inn. Luke tugged at her hand, his dark eyes looking up at her with a silent question. "Mom, when will we eat?" Elizabeth swallowed hard, forcing down the aching pain spreading through her body. "Soon, my love. I'll find a way." How many times had she said that? "I'll find a way. I'll take care of it. Everything will be okay." How many times had those lies left her lips, yet never once become the truth? The sun began to set. Elizabeth felt her legs about to give out. She was used to hunger, to the cold, to the scornful looks of the world, but she had never gotten used to the pain of watching her children endure it all. Matthew was too exhausted to go on. He collapsed, gasping for breath. Elizabeth knelt beside him, holding him tightly. "We'll find a place to rest, my love. Just a little longer." But where would take them in? A poor woman with 5 deaf children, cursed, as they were seen to be. Who would open their doors to them? They found an abandoned barn outside a small village. There was no one there. No lights, no voices. Elizabeth pushed open the wooden door. A damp, musty smell filled her nose, but at least there was no wind. She helped her children inside and then collapsed, her body completely drained. Matthew and Sophia curled up together, Luke rested his head in her lap, Andrew and Helen pressed close to each other for warmth. All 5 children fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. Elizabeth looked at their thin, pale faces, her heart aching like a knife twisting in her chest. She stroked Luke's hair, then Matthew's, then Sophia's. Her hands trembled. She couldn't go on like this. What was she supposed to do? Night fell completely. Elizabeth remained there, unmoving, unsleeping. She had once been strong. She had once believed that if she tried hard enough, if she endured enough, she would find a way. But now, as she stared into the endless darkness ahead, she no longer believed that. Fate had struck her down too many times. She had lost her husband. Lost her home. Lost everything. She and her children had nothing left but darkness. And silence. Tears slipped silently down Elizabeth's gaunt cheeks. If she disappeared, would her children have a better life? Would the world be kinder to them without a mother who was cursed? The thought flashed through her mind, and she recoiled in horror. No. She couldn't think that way. She couldn't abandon her children. They had already lost too much. They couldn't lose their mother, too. But she also couldn't let them keep suffering like this. She had to do something. She stood up, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the barn. She walked toward the village. Even if she had to beg, even if she had to endure humiliation, she would find a way to get food for her children. But when Elizabeth knocked on the first door, a middle-aged woman peeked out, looking her up and down with a cold stare. "We have nothing for you," the woman said, her voice dry and sharp. "Just a little food." "I'll work in return," Elizabeth pleaded. The woman shook her head. "Who do you think you are? Leave before someone calls the guards." The door slammed shut. Elizabeth stared at it, feeling as though the last sliver of hope inside her had just been crushed. She turned away and dragged her weary steps to another house. But every house was the same. No one was willing to help her. No one wanted to be involved with her. She was an outcast whether in Silver Creek or anywhere else. By the time Elizabeth returned to the abandoned barn, her legs felt like they could barely hold her up. She had failed. She knelt down, wrapping her arms around her 5 sleeping children, her shoulders trembling. She had tried her best. She had fought until the end. But the world had rejected her. There was nowhere left for them to go. Nothing left to hope for. Only the cold night surrounding them. And the deadly silence. 25 years later. On a day when strong winds swept through the small streets of Silver Creek, carrying the scent of lavender fields in full bloom, the town no longer looked as gloomy as before. But its cobblestone streets and old houses remained unchanged. A procession of elegant carriages rolled slowly through the town square. Their polished surfaces gleamed under the golden afternoon sunlight, drawing the attention of onlookers. But what truly shocked the townspeople were the people stepping out of those carriages. A middle-aged woman, poised and graceful, yet carrying an unbreakable strength in her demeanor. Time had left its marks on her face, but her eyes still burned with an indomitable will. She was Elizabeth Miller. And beside her stood her 5 children, not the trembling, rain-soaked children of that night long ago, but strong, accomplished, and proud individuals. Luke, a master carpenter, whose exquisite wooden creations were sold all across America. Matthew, a renowned chef, owner of a famous restaurant chain specializing in traditional cuisine. Sophia, an exceptional seamstress, founder of a prestigious fashion brand. Andrew, a painter, whose works were displayed in the grandest galleries of New York. Helen, a disability rights advocate, who had transformed the lives of countless children like her younger self. They had returned. And this time, no one dared to look down on them. The townspeople flooded the streets, whispering among themselves. Is that really Elizabeth? My God, they actually came back. The cursed children from back then. They look like proper gentlemen and ladies now. Astonishment filled every gaze. Those who had once turned their backs on Elizabeth now stood frozen, unable to meet her steady yet piercing gaze. In the crowd, one face turned pale. Margaret. The woman who once held absolute power in Silver Creek, the one who had driven Elizabeth and her children to despair. She was no longer the proud figure she had been. Her hair had turned completely white, and deep wrinkles of age and bitterness marred her face. She took a step back upon seeing Elizabeth. But this time, it was Elizabeth who stepped forward. Margaret, Elizabeth spoke, her voice calm yet razor-sharp. Margaret flinched. She swallowed hard, trying to regain the air of authority she had lost long ago. Elizabeth. I never expected you to return, she said, but her voice no longer carried the power it once did. Elizabeth gave a faint smile. I imagine you hoped I never would. Margaret stiffened. She glanced around, but no one stood by her side anymore. The townspeople, the same ones who had once followed her lead, now remained silent, merely watching. They had seen what Elizabeth and her children had achieved. They had seen Margaret's downfall. She was no longer the queen of this town. Matthew stepped forward, crossing his arms as he looked at the woman who had made his mother weep for so many years. Back then, you called us a disgrace, he said, his voice devoid of anger, just a plain, undeniable truth. But it seems that now, you're the one being abandoned. Margaret's face turned pale. Luke smirked. We don't need to take revenge on you. Life has already done that for us. A soft breeze blew past, carrying away the whispers of the crowd. Margaret clenched her fists, but she had no argument to make. She knew she had lost. Elizabeth no longer paid her any attention. She turned to face the town, looking at the familiar streets, the faces of those who had once shunned her. I did not return for revenge, she said, her voice calm yet resolute. I returned because I have something to do. A hush fell over the crowd. Everyone knew Elizabeth was never one for empty words. If she had come back, there was a reason. And that reason was surely not insignificant. She walked toward the town square. And then, the townspeople saw the large sign that had just been put up. Silver Creek Center for Children with Disabilities. The entire town gasped in shock. Elizabeth turned back, her eyes gleaming with an unshakable serenity. You once believed that children like mine were a curse, she said, looking straight at Margaret. But we all know now that true strength lies in love and perseverance. Margaret opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Because everyone was looking at Elizabeth. Not with disdain, as they once had. But with admiration. With respect. Elizabeth had not returned as a cast-out woman seeking vengeance. She had returned as a symbol of resilience. She had won. Not through hatred. But through kindness. In over 25 years, Silver Creek had never witnessed a day like this. The town that once cursed, shunned, and drove Elizabeth and her children away now stood in awe of their triumphant return. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the family they had once called cursed. But today, no one dared to whisper cruel words anymore. Today, all they could do was look on in shock, shame, and deep regret. Margaret took a step back as she faced Elizabeth. She no longer had the commanding, imposing presence she once did. Now, she was just an old woman, her hair stark white, her face deeply lined with the wrinkles of time and the weight of her miscalculations. She wanted to hold on to the last remnants of her pride, but when Elizabeth's gaze met hers, her confidence crumbled. No one stood by her anymore. Luke stepped forward, his sharp eyes locking onto the woman who had once been so cruel to his family. "Do you have nothing left to say, Margaret?" Margaret bit her lip, but no words came out. Matthew spoke slowly, not with anger or resentment, but with a truth that could not be denied. "Years ago, you cast us out of this town. You treated us like garbage." He looked around, his gaze sweeping across the faces of those watching. "But now, we are back. Not because we need your approval. But to prove that we never needed it in the first place." Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it again. She had no defense. Because now, she was the one being cast out. Someone in the crowd whispered. "She has nothing left. Isn't her estate about to be seized?" "That's right. I heard she mortgaged all her land to invest, and lost everything. I even heard she's about to lose her house, too." Margaret clenched her fists. No. That couldn't be. She had once been the queen of this town. How could she now be left with nothing? But as she looked at the eyes surrounding her, she knew the truth was undeniable. No one feared her anymore. No one flattered or bowed to her. She had lost everything. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt the pain that Elizabeth had once endured. To be cast out. To be abandoned. To be despised. For the first time, she understood what it felt like to have the whole world turn its back on her. She had once held the power to control the lives of others, but now, no one cared about her. No one wanted to help. No one wanted to stand by her. Elizabeth looked at the woman before her, the woman who had once mercilessly driven her into despair. She could have reveled in this moment. She could have taken her revenge. She could have spoken the cruelest words imaginable. But she did none of those things. She simply looked at Margaret, her eyes free of hatred. Elizabeth let out a quiet sigh, then slowly said, "Once upon a time, when you pushed my mother and me into despair, I once thought, if one day I had the chance, I would make you endure the same pain I suffered." Margaret looked up, her heart pounding in her chest. Everyone fell silent. But Elizabeth only smiled gently. "But today, standing before you, I realize. I don't need to do that." Margaret was stunned. She had thought Elizabeth would trample on her suffering. But no. No words of insult. No sarcasm. No resentment. Only a proud forgiveness. "Hatred cannot change the past," Elizabeth continued, her voice calm yet sharp. "But kindness can change the future." The entire town was silent. Margaret trembled, unable to respond. Elizabeth had not only defeated her. She had risen above her. Luke turned to his mother, his eyes full of pride. "Mother, we don't need revenge. We've already won." Elizabeth nodded, her gaze still gentle. Because even when others treat us poorly, we can still choose to respond with kindness. Margaret said nothing more. She stepped back, then turned around and walked away. No one stopped her. No one cared where she went. Because now, she was the one forgotten. Elizabeth watched her retreating figure, but there was no hatred left in her heart. She had left the past behind. She had moved on. Because she knew that from this day forward, her family would no longer be outcasts. They had proven their worth. Not with hatred, but with love and kindness. That afternoon, Silver Creek witnessed something unprecedented. The cobblestone streets, once so familiar with gossip, curses, and scorn, were now filled with an entirely different atmosphere. People no longer gathered to talk about someone's misfortune. They gathered to welcome, to witness, to applaud. A large sign bearing the words Silver Creek Center for Children with Disabilities had just been erected in the town square. All eyes were fixed on it, as if no one could believe this was truly happening. Those who had once called Elizabeth's family cursed, those who had turned away when she and her children were cast out of town in a storm years ago, now stood packed around the square, waiting for this momentous event. Elizabeth stepped onto the podium, standing amidst thunderous applause. Applause for her. Applause for the 5 children who had once been abandoned, who had now become extraordinary individuals, each carrying a story of overcoming fate. Luke, Matthew, Sophia, Andrew, Helen, they were no longer the children driven out of this town. They were the ones who had returned in triumph. And that triumph did not come from hatred. It came from love, perseverance, and forgiveness. Elizabeth took a deep breath, then spoke. I never thought there would come a day when I would stand here. The entire square fell silent, with only the sound of the gentle wind passing through. Because 25 years ago, I left with nothing but empty hands and 5 children who had nothing but a love I was willing to sacrifice everything to protect. She looked around, her gaze sweeping over each face. Some of you turned your backs on me. Some of you cast my children and me out. And some of you simply chose to remain silent. Some people lowered their heads, unable to face her. But I did not return to blame anyone. Elizabeth smiled softly. I returned to do what should have been done long ago. She turned toward the newly constructed building, the first support center for disabled children in the town. This will be a place where every child can find hope. A round of applause erupted once more, this time even stronger than before. The townspeople began murmuring among themselves. We once thought they were a curse. But now, look at them. The children from back then are now successful. And they still came back to help this town. Who would have thought? Luke stepped forward, placing a hand on his mother's shoulder, his eyes shining with pride. You did it, Mother, he said, using sign language so his siblings could understand. Elizabeth looked at her children, tears of happiness welling up. No, my dear. We did it. From within the crowd, an elderly woman slowly stepped forward. She moved hesitantly, uncertainty written all over her face. It was Clara, the owner of a small diner from years ago, the only person who had ever wanted to help Elizabeth but never dared to. Clara lowered her head. I'm sorry. Elizabeth looked at her, saying nothing. Clara bit her lip, then summoned the courage to continue. I should have done more. I should have stood up for you. The people around them held their breath. Then, Elizabeth stepped down and took Clara's hands in hers. The past doesn't matter anymore, Clara, she said gently. What matters is that now, we can change the future together. She gave Clara's hands a reassuring squeeze, a silent gesture of forgiveness. Clara broke down in tears. One by one, other townspeople stepped forward. I'm sorry too, Elizabeth. I was wrong to turn my back on you. We never understood your family. Apologies poured out, like a flood breaking free after years of being held back. And Elizabeth, the woman who had once been cast aside, simply smiled. Because she didn't need apologies to move forward. She had already overcome everything. She had become a symbol of resilience. Matthew stepped up, patting Andrew's shoulder. "Come on, it's time." Andrew nodded, then signed toward Helen. She nodded back, stepping forward with a red ribbon in her hands. Luke handed the scissors to their mother. "This honor belongs to you," he said. Elizabeth took a deep breath, then raised the scissors. The entire town held its breath. And then, in a moment of destiny, she cut the red ribbon. The Silver Creek Center for Children with Disabilities was officially opened. Thunderous applause filled the air. The first deaf and mute children ran forward, their faces beaming with hope. Helen knelt down, signing to a little girl. "Now, you have a place where you belong." The little girl smiled radiantly, her eyes brimming with tears. Elizabeth looked up at the clear blue sky. 25 years ago, she had left with nothing but empty hands. Today, she returned with a legacy. A legacy of love, compassion, and resilience. They were no longer the outcasts. They were living proof of the triumph of kindness. The story of Elizabeth and her children was a testament to the power of perseverance, compassion, and forgiveness. Though abandoned, they did not succumb to injustice but used their efforts and talents to prove their worth. Hatred could not change the past, but kindness could shape the future. Their return was not for revenge but to create something better. Their story serves as a reminder that no one has the right to dictate another's fate, and that true justice is the victory of a kind heart.